1997 marks the 30th anniversary of the first annual Field Directors Conference, now the International Field Directors Field Technologies Conference. The very first Field Directors Conference, however, was held in Ann Arbor, Michigan in March 1951. Although the structure of the organization has evolved and become more formal, the goals of Field Directors Field Technologies have not changed a great deal over the years. A report on the 1951 conference states, "The idea for the conference stemmed from the need for a type of informal communication between field personnel which is not usually provided for at professional conventions or through professional journals." A great many people have contributed to the development and the history of the conference, and we invited three of them to share their recollections with us: Maury Axelrod, Charlie Kennel, and Bill Nichols. As with many of us, the paths by which they came to survey research and to the Field Directors Field Technologies were to a certain degree unmapped and vary greatly.
I graduated, did my undergraduate work at the University of New Hampshire, and in 1938 went to Ohio State to graduate school, where I was majoring in clinical psychology, doing my work with the very famous therapist Carl Rogers. And I had worked with Carl to about 1942. And
to begin with, I'm a sociologist by training. My experience was in population and demography and social psychology. As a Depression kid, out of necessity, I deferred higher education to work, and I started out working evenings as a copy boy at the Detroit Times. During the day, I hung around Wayne State University, where all of my friends were enrolled in school, and I sat in on classes and took them seriously, but I was not matriculated. And I took courses in philosophy, history, art, and others, but no credit for them. Later, when I was in Washington, I took a few courses at GW, but I hadn't really expected to get a college education, with the Depression standing in the way of that. However, following World War II, I was able to take advantage of the GI Bill to carry me through from freshman to doctorate.
Well, I guess go back to in college. I was originally a math major and then took sociology as a double major. And by the time I finished college, I was committed to sociology, although not necessarily survey research. And then I went to, 52, I went to Columbia University, and in sociology with a minor in math stat. And at Columbia, you couldn't be in sociology without being in survey research. Paul Lazarsfeld was there, Herb Hyman, Marty Lipset, Jim Coleman was a fellow student. We were trained in surveys and stat, and if you wanted a job, the only place you could really work was at the Bureau of Applied Social Research in one of its parts. So I came up after a year in fellowship. I started as a counter sorter operator in the machine room. I interviewed in the Lower East Side in Jersey City. I was a coder for 6 months. I did factor analysis on Friedens before there were computers, and then sort of worked my way up to project director for Bureau of Applied Social Research.
In 1942, of course, the World War II, we got into it, and you really had to get out of school at that time. So at this point, I was looking around for a job to get out of school. And Rensis Lickert, the famous Lickert scale Rensis, ran a survey organization in the Department of Agriculture. And a lot of us had been in that, a lot of them, not me at that time, a lot of people had been in that organization. And it expanded in size greatly when the war started, because the group was doing surveys for all kinds of war agencies, housing, health, everything else under the sun. And there was an interviewing staff for that center, but it was nowhere near large enough to do the work that was required. And Rensis wondered where he could get someone who would know something about interviewing to train the interviewers. And he knew about Carl Rogers, and he went to Carl and asked him if he would be willing to adapt some of his techniques to the attitude surveys in Department of Agriculture. And Carl said he would, and in true academic fashion, he said, I'll get 2 graduate students to do it. So I was one of those 2, and the other was Vic Ramey, who was shortly thereafter the chairman of the psych department at the University of Colorado. And we generated a series of techniques that we thought would work for field interviewing in surveys, and tried them out by getting some of the staff from the Department of Agriculture in to do these. And then we set up a training program. It was about a week length for about 15 people each time, and we ran it for 4 periods. After that, I joined Rentz's. He said, well, this has gone great. Why don't you come and work for us and continue the training and supervision of the interviewers? So in, I think it was July '42, I went to Washington and started the work, and before long was director of that field operation, and worked there until 1946, at which time I came to University of Michigan to help set up the Survey Research Center.
During the Depression, many of us took every civil service exam offered for which we could qualify. I think my career in a crime lab with the FBI was aborted when the fingerprint classifier list was used to fill the many coding positions that were available, that had become available with the 1940 decennial census. And from lowly coder, I worked my way up to lowly assistant section chief, and then was drafted. This was all before Pearl Harbor. I spent the next 5 years in the military and returned to the Census Bureau after the war, still as a coder. After a few months of coding foreign trade statistics, I decided that I was not satisfied to end my career as a coder, so I took a leave of absence to return to resume my education and increase my value to the Census Bureau. And I continued to extend my leave of absence for 5 or so years until the Bureau became impatient and insisted that I should return or terminate. In the meantime, I was completing an undergraduate degree at the University of Michigan. The timing was propitious. The Survey Research Center was making University of Michigan its new home, and I immediately applied for employment, and on the basis of my census experience was hired as a coder and was able to leave my job as a clothing salesman at Montgomery Ward. As I progressed with my education, I also advanced within the Survey Research Center. All of this time I was working full-time within the Survey Center, as well as carrying a full academic load. At the time, I was working on my doctorate. We received the Ford Foundation grant to establish the Detroit area study. Following my stint with the Detroit area study, I joined Charlie Cattle in the field office. He was directing the field operation, and I became the associate director. My
main dissertation advisor was Robert Merton, who fortunately didn't know an awful lot about surveys, which was one reason I never finished my dissertation. I took courses from Lazarsfeld. We did surveys on medical students in the sociology of medicine. I worked with Ed Brunner on a survey of adult education, the leaders of adult education, and did a lot of elite interviewing for that and traveling. All other kinds of surveys. The Bureau did commercial research. We did a survey for Lipton Tea, and we did a survey on the Edsel car. We did a lot of things. Well, I was working on my dissertation and full-time project director in the Bureau of Applied Social Research, and they were planning to hire somebody else from Columbia to go teach undergraduate methods and social methods, a stat, at Berkeley. And he couldn't go due to his wife's illness. So at the last minute, they invited me, if I wanted to do that, come in as a lecturer. And a lot of the people I'd known, the Bureau had already migrated to Berkeley. Charlie Glock, Hannon Selvin, Marty Lipset. And so I decided, gee, this is an opportunity. Berkeley was one of the leading departments of sociology, so I accepted and went off. And first year was full-time research, but after that, I got involved in the newly developed Berkeley Server Research Center, and by the end of the second year, I was sort of committed to that. Eventually stopped teaching before, and went full-time research. 59 was I went to Berkeley, and I was there then 20 years. I think after the second year I was there, it was something like deputy director, assistant director, executive officer, and I held that position really for 18 years, except for 3 years when I was acting director. And I was in charge of sampling, always. I was put over field operations, which is where I got interested in field operations. At times I was in charge of data processing. It's a small shop. I wrote most of the contracts that weren't written by professors for academic projects. I wrote most of the reports for those projects, so it was do everything which you have to do in a small shop. And by 1980, I'd come to the Census Bureau, and since I've been at the Census Bureau, I only missed 2 meetings at Field Tech.
My work in survey research allowed me to act out my personality disorders in a setting where compulsive tendencies appear normal and obsessive dedication to precision, perfection, rigor, reliability are valued, particularly in questionnaire design, coding, and data collection.
So never having intended to, I've been in survey research all my life, 50 years now.
Approximately 180 people registered for the 1997 International Field Directors Field Technologies Conference. Early conferences were quite small by comparison. All session participants could sit around one table, and there were no concurrent sessions. Charlie Cannell recalls the 1951 conference.
Well, every time we had a discussion with other people in the field, there was immediate a discussion started. What are you doing about hiring? What are you doing about training? How much are you paying the interviewers? That was the main one. How much are you paying the interviewers? And all kinds of things like this. And finally, one time, we said, well, gee, we ought to set up a conference and get people together to swap ideas, not to present formal papers, but to swap ideas and have discussions with people who have common problems. And there was no professional organization that got interested in those sorts of things. APOR went on with its paper reading and discussions and so forth. But you couldn't talk about, well, what are you going to pay interviewers? Or how do you train interviewers? And there was no place, there was no organization that handled these things. I'm a psychologist, and the APA was just not interested in sociology, wasn't interested in this. So we decided that we ought to set up a conference of some sort. And we circulated around to find out who was interested, and there was terrific interest in it. Said, well, let's do it. And so Bob Peebles, who was the senior supervisor at that time, and I sat down to list the main topics. And we wrote to people who had said they would be interested and said, suggest the topics that you think are most interested, and who do you think would be good to talk about these? And we got a lot of suggestions from it. It meant we had to set up criteria, and they are very much the same as the field directors conferences now. Needed to have a full-time interviewing staff of some sort, needed personal training, need to use probability samples. I forget, there were 1 or 2 other criteria of that sort. And the organizations who could meet these criteria, we accepted. So we had planned a conference for about 20 people, just sitting around talking about things. Ended up by accepting 35 people, and we were able to limit it to that. And it was set up for 3 days, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 4 sessions a day, 2 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon. It was to be led by a couple of people who gave some of the suggestions as to what the issues were, and they came from quite different organizations. And then there was an hour and a half free discussion. There was no presentations of papers or anything of that sort. And it was a terrific discussion. People were fascinated with it, and everybody had these common problems. So it went very well. We had a dinner the second night that Orensis Linkert introduced the conference and discussed his interest in survey methods and survey interviewing particularly. Angus Campbell gave the dinner talk, and he's terrific at that. So, and particularly having started off as being an interviewer, he could talk about that. And we had people from all over the place. Let me just tell you who they were. From Census, from the U.S. government, we had Census, BLS, Department of Agriculture, Bureau of the Budget, Federal Trade Commission, Housing and Home Financing. Some of these organizations don't exist. The Canadians got interested. They sent representatives from the Dominion Bureau of Statistics, Department of National Defense, not quite sure what they were doing there, and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Universities were Washington State University, University of Chicago, University of Washington, and University of Michigan. Private organizations. There were two private organizations who were doing good probability sampling. That was Alfred Pulitz and National Analysts. Interestingly enough, the person from Alfred Pulitz was Les Frankel, whose son, Marty, is well known in sampling today. So we're in the second generation of people here. It started off, introductory remarks by Orensis Linkert. First session, these will sound so familiar. I think a lot of these topics haven't changed over the years. We haven't settled any of them yet. First one was on selection of interviewers. The last session of the meeting on Saturday afternoon was headed by W. Edwards Deming, who was at that time a member of the Bureau of the Budget. We should have had another one 2 or 3 years later. We kept getting requests for it, but it was a busy time for us and it was hard to organize, so it didn't, and I forget when the second one was, but it was quite some time later.
Many people figured prominently in the early years of Field Director's Field Technologies, but none more than the late John Scott, Field Director at the University of Michigan's Survey Research Center. In the 1960s, John Scott wrote a memorandum calling for a conference on field problems in survey research. The result was the first annual Field Directors Field Technologies Conference in 1968 in Ann Arbor. His memorandum stands today as a fine statement of our goals and an early charter for the organization.
Many names come back to me now. John Scott, of course. I think he might be thought of as the father of the Field Directors Conferences. He gave direction and leadership to the early meetings and was probably most responsible for the strength and the value and the continuity of the conferences. We all looked forward to the next year's conference, and I think that was largely John Scott who made them socially viable.
I remember more about the 1980 Field Directors meeting, which was at Michigan under the John Scott era, and it was 40 to 60 people throughout that time sitting around the room. Everything was a plenary session, very few prepared papers, occasional breakout, and to demonstrate the informality after the session ended on Tuesday afternoon, John Scott said, anyone who's still around tonight is invited to my house for dinner. And that kind of informal small group thing did continue for quite a few years.
I'm not exactly sure when it was that Maury joined us, but he took over almost all the work in developing the field and was the field director while I started doing some methodological research. And then he was followed by John Scott, who also carried on the field operation for quite a while and had a tragic death in 1980, I think it was, something like that. It was a very sad business.
His passing was a sad event, especially ironic. Applying his understanding of group dynamics, he arranged the tables and seating to facilitate communication. When smoking became an issue, he regrouped and managed to keep smokers and non-smokers happy until smoking was banned during sessions. Unfortunately, John succumbed to lung cancer.
The 1951 and 1968 conferences set the tone for future conferences. The goals, criteria for participation, atmosphere, and topics remain the same in 1997, although we continually struggle against becoming too large and too formal.
It was very informal, relatively unstructured, and my guess is that that was a reflection of Rensis Lickert's indoctrination in all of us of his concepts of participatory democracy. Decisions, plans, process seemed to be based on consensus. There were no officers, no bylaws, no permanent or continuing staff. There were few rules and a developing tradition. The participation in the Field Directors Conference was limited to not-for-profit organizations, academic institutions, and governmental organizations, all of whom had a field operation that was tended to be regional or national, so they had common interests and common problems. Participants were mainly university organizations with a few of the governmental agencies, as I recall, and I won't try to enumerate them. Each of these organizations was allowed to send 2 representatives to the meeting. The intention was to keep the group rather small so there could be direct face-to-face continuing conversation rather than presentations. And the representatives were those persons who were concerned with policy or implementation of policy. And as I recall, I think there were about 20 of us who met each time, and it gradually grew, but it seemed to be a decent number, one where we could develop close camaraderie and looked forward to seeing each other again year after year. The reason for the exclusion of profit-making organizations, I think, may be an obvious one. There was no concern about proprietary interests or sharing secrets or procedures that would give another organization a competitive advantage. These conferences were intended to provide a forum or a forum for exchange and sharing of experiences, such topics as methodological developments, administrative procedures, hiring and training interviewers, supervision of data collection procedures, quality control, pay costs, and so on, all the kinds of field problems that we were grappling with, and we acted as sort of a support group for each other. At each of the sessions, we devoted modest amount of time, or more than a modest amount of time, to dealing with interviewer issues, selection of interviewers, training of interviewers, payment of interviewers, supervision, quality control, response rates, and breakdown of costs between interviewer salary, expenses, travel, and so on. Typically, topic presentations were brief and were intended primarily to provide a focus for conversation and discussion, although over time they developed into more ambitious full-scale presentations of papers, and these tended to be on current, ongoing research that may not have yet been published or that was contemplated by the host organizations. The timing or the scheduling of the meetings, I had APOR in mind, so that we arranged to meet prior to APOR or following APOR to allow participation in both meetings in the Field Directors Conference and in APOR. And eventually they became linked in location as well, where the field directors met on the same premises as APOR, but a couple of days prior to or a couple of days following.
Well, I think there was a gradual growth of interest in CADI and CAPI, CADI in particular, at Field Technologies. I mean, there was a natural outgrowth of an interest in telephone interviewing, but as CADI began to spread and to develop across the academic and government uses, there were more sessions on it, and the number of sessions seemed to increase a little bit every year, and that brought in more people from government and from the bigger agencies, who were the ones to get into the technologies first. And it was, however, gradual, so even as late as, say, 87, we were coming up on, 40 to 60 people and plenary sessions. Now, one of the things that happened was, because all sessions were plenary, people who were not into CADI, people who were not there yet, found these not very exciting. And although they might say, well, someday I'll get into this, they'd pay attention. But what may have broken the back was CAPI, because CAPI was expensive. Only big federal agencies were really seriously thinking about it for a while. And so I think the people who were coming from the smaller shops, who were still doing some paper and pencil and some CADI now, but they were really beginning to get upset with all this emphasis on the technology. I think there was a watershed year where things really changed, and it was 87, and this was a meeting in Raleigh, and I was program chair along with Yuda Sebestik, and she was also interested in CAPI, and I think we may have scheduled more sessions on the technology side than had been before. In addition to which, there had been a rule: an organization could only send 2 people to these meetings, and that had not been well observed, and was becoming less well observed. It may have been creeping up to 4. But at Raleigh, RTI sent about, I think, somewhere between 15 and 20 people to sit as observers, and it gave the sense the organization was no longer small, and it gave the sense the organization was much too heavily involved in CADI and CAPI for those who didn't have a great interest in it. I don't know quite how it happened, but the program chairs for the next meeting, which was to be in Toronto, who were Eve Fielder and Laurel Hill, they got a lot of feedback from the small shops. It's time to stop this. And so they said, let's go back to where we'll have at most 1 session on field directors on CADI and CAPI, and that's all, because we want to restore to the way we were before, smaller shops emphasis, continual emphasis on specifically field-type topics, interview, recruiting, refusals, tracing, all those things. And so the 88 meeting was set up to be that way, but E. Fielder did stick in a final session, which had something like field directors, where has it come from and where is it going, a chance to rethink what this organization should be. Coming up on the 88 meeting, this was quite explicit that while the small shops wanted to return to predominantly field topics, there had been over the years now created a group of people who went to field directors because they wanted to talk about CADI and CAPI. And so if they were shut out, if they were limited to 1 session only, they had no place to meet and exchange ideas. So in April of 88, just before the May meeting in Toronto, I circulated a memorandum to like 20 key people in the field outside the Census Bureau, saying maybe it was time to have a field technologies conference and to meet concurrently or near or somehow around field directors conference. And I got considerable positive response. I also asked people if they were willing to be in a committee to help form such an organization, and the cream of the crop, I think, volunteered to participate and be part of an organizing committee. And I can mention, I hope I can get them all, Reg Baker, Bill Connett, Shap Wolf, Betsy Morton, Dale DeWitt, Gary Catlin, forgetting somebody, Ray Halley from agriculture. Very powerful and group. So I proposed at that session on where are we going that there be such an organization. And the main response was, well, it seems logistically difficult to do. How are you going to have a separate organization? And after the Toronto meetings, I proposed how it be done, with the field directors starting on a Sunday and ending on Tuesday noon, and field technology starting on a Monday and ending on Wednesday noon, being totally separate except for one meeting on Tuesday, and maybe a banquet in common. And that was the plan that was adopted. There also was this planning group met at the Stat Canada Symposium in that same year and got together, put a program together, drafted bylaws and a charter, and was all ready to go by the '89 meeting. I think there had been a charter. I'm trying to reconstruct this. Only Shap Wolf knows for sure. But he dug out what apparently was the old charter, or whatever records there were on the field directors when he drafted the field technologies charter. And we changed some of the rules, like we opened it eventually to 4 people per agency and 4 more if they were on the program, which would give you 8 per agency for field technologies. And in time, because we had a charter, field directors decided we would be part of the same organization, adopt a similar charter. So in time, this became a common charter and a common organization. When we started to put field technologies together, we said we wanted to respect the rights of the people who wanted to talk about just field topics and the small shops, and always make sure they had the sessions they wanted. That we didn't want to dominate, we wanted to be a separate side part of this. Well, the very first field technologies meeting I couldn't go to. My wife was too ill, and I've been to every one since. And I think I was correct when I predicted beforehand that field technologies would be the bigger organization. I think it was at least the same size right from the first time they both met. But I think it's pleasant that they decided they really wanted to be similar, or they wanted to have essentially common meetings where people could wander to either side, and yet would have room for both sets of interests, would have more formal meetings and informal meetings as well.
Anyone who has ever attended a Field Directors Field Technologies Conference has great stories to tell of people, places, and events.
I don't really have any war stories to relate, but I have a lot of pleasant recollections. Mostly what stands out in my mind are the interpersonal interactions, the friendships, the camaraderie, the relaxed informality, the renewal of acquaintanceship each year. One was the Wisconsin conference at University of Wisconsin, where typically, and I hadn't mentioned this earlier, but at our meetings where we had sessions dealing with methodology and administrative matters, our dinners were generally followed by a speaker who made a presentation. The speaker was often director of that field organization or someone prominent in the field who had some important developments to communicate to us. In this particular instance, the communication took another form. Bud Sharp, in lieu of the traditional after-dinner presentation, performed for us by slapping the strings of his bass as his jazz trio entertained us.
It was 81 San Diego meetings where we were to have a speaker, Bob Groves, who was in at the census and who was maybe 90 Well, it must be 91. And he was not allowed to come by the Census Bureau deputy director. And so it became a rallying cry of that meeting, Bob Groves can't come. And to fill the time in, we created a stand-up comedy night, and a number of us got up and told stories, and I was fortunate enough to be master of ceremonies, and I really enjoyed that evening. That was a wonderful time. And we had Reg Baker and Colm O'Murkety and Paul Moore and Ray Halley and Sue Lavin all get up and tell stories, and I thought that was a great deal of fun.
Here at Arizona State University, we hosted meetings in Carefree one year. Carefree is a resort community, a bit of a distance from the Phoenix airport, and there were some mutterings of discontent because of the distance and time needed to reach there until we settled into this desert paradise. There were lovely pools, gardens with a variety of desert plants, pheasant coveys, cottontail rabbits, all calmed their grumbling, and it was a very successful session. Also one time here when we hosted the meetings in Scottsdale, we had a double header. Warren Miller had just recently joined us at Arizona State University, and he graciously consented to deliver the after-dinner address. And Vladimir Schlappentoch, who was a recent refugee from the Soviet Union, relocated to Michigan State University, and he joined us as a speaker after lunch and was able to inform us on the state of polling and surveying in the Soviet Union. Earlier meeting that I thought was wonderful, it was sort of silly, was Chicago. I think it was 85. And we had a dinner in a Chinese restaurant, and we didn't have enough people to fill the restaurant, so they used the other half of this banquet area for a Chinese wedding. And they hung between the two, they just had some drapes, so you could hear everything through this. The speaker was Seymour Sudman, who was going to talk on the future of survey research, and I'm sure had a great talk. But when he got up to talk, on the wedding side, they got really loud. I think they were drinking quite a bit. So there was all this interruption of noise from the other side of the curtain. And I was sitting next to Paul Sheetsley, who was a wonderful man, and we got giggling. And we couldn't stop. We thought it was so funny. And some of the older women, there must have been women older than us at that time, Ellen Spector and so on, looked around like, you silly boys, can't you behave yourself? But we couldn't. And I think we giggled all the way through Sudman's talk. And he had the Chinese on one side and Sheetsley and Nichols on the other. And he managed to finish. It's amazing he spoke to us after that. But that was certainly a lot of fun. We generally were housed in fine hotels or nice resort areas, or at York University in the Toronto area, we were housed in the dorms with men and women housed on separate floors, and married couples on another floor, and this was change from our usual continuing interaction during the evening. In New York, we stayed across from Lincoln Center in a hotel which was undergoing a facelift, and I think liposuction at the same time because they were tearing out the innards, and major reconstruction was in progress through the night, drill hammers, etc. So we caught up on our sleep during the conference. And I would hope that my major contribution to these events was raising the level of food appreciation of our group by my ferreting out local gastronomic gems in each community where we met. Charlie Cannell, for example, got up and talked about the early days. And he was, before John Scott, he ran field directors, and I remember he gave a very nice talk. So yes, there used to be a banquet speaker at every session. And somehow that dwindled away when some of them proved to be pretty boring, and some of them and people started drifting away from the banquets. But when we had a
some sort of comedy routine, then things went very well. There was another one in St. Petersburg Beach where Owen Thornberry took over the evening's entertainment, and a number of us told jokes, and Owen gave out awards to various people who were attending. For example, he gave Bill Connett the Mr. Goody Two-Shoes Award for his behavior, but then at the business meeting that followed, he withdrew it after Bill had misbehaved a bit. So, but we had a lot of fun at some of those meetings. Well, there was another session that I particularly remember. I'm not sure which year it was. I think it may have been the same year that Owen led the after-dinner activities, which was a session in which Owen and I had a debate on the value of Cappy, and there were other speakers, Gene Martin and Sherry Cortland, I think, also. But Owen took occasion to make a personal attack, suggesting that all the good things I said would follow from Cappy were all baloney, to put it more politely than Owen did, and that therefore I was misleading the field. And I got up and I felt had a fairly interesting rejoinder that put Owen down a bit, but I think we both enlightened the issues. We had a wonderful time doing it. We weren't the least bit mad at each other personally, and that was a session which some claim led to the later activities where we got name calling, such as whiny obstructionist and etc.
A review of programs over the years reveals that we're addressing the same issues in 1997 that survey researchers and field operations staff addressed in 1951. However, the introduction of telephone interviewing, CADI and CAPI, and more recently other technologies have had a significant impact on shaping the conference as it has evolved.
But it's still the case that you can't really do surveys, and you can't learn about them, and you can't appreciate them by going to the professional organizations. The Field Directors Conference is doing a terrific job, I think, and it is interesting to note that the same issues are with us, and they change some. They change when we got into telephone interviewing, when we got into CADI, and so forth.
I've expressed my comfort with the informality of the organization and the lack of structure, which seems somewhat inconsistent with my efforts over the years to try to codify the rules and standardize some of the procedures. We had no secretariat. Every time we had a conference, people would have to scurry around determining what the membership list was, who was involved, and if it happened to be a new organization, they would have to consult with all of us to determine how to set up the meetings, whether dues were to be charged, and whether to have formal presentations or not. So over the years, I kept trying to impose some sort of structure without success, although I understand now there are bylaws in the working constitution, and there may even be officers for all I know.
Part of the growth, of course, was simply this proved to be a very successful vehicle, I think, the field technologies, for people who were just getting into CADI or wanted to know about CAPI, for both government agencies and private agencies, for all of them to come together and exchange views. And it grew because it was popular, and then it even expanded, of course, internationally in time. I think even if there hadn't been a field technologies, survey research itself was growing, and the field side alone would have grown even if there hadn't had a second organization. There are many sessions now that sound just like the sessions 20 years ago. And I think that's because many of those problems will always be with us, whether they are how to design a questionnaire best, or how to recruit interviewers, or where to recruit interviewers from, or convert non-respondents. Those problems were there probably 50 years ago, and they'll probably be there 50 years in the future. They were perpetual problems.
We asked Charlie, Maury, and Bill what each felt were the issues future International Field Directors Field Technologies conferences would face.
What the issues are today, thank God I don't have to know, except to deal with the many nuisance telephone surveys that we get, interrupting my dinner and on other intimate occasions. We used to worry about our response rates, that they would occasionally slip below 85%. I assume that at least this problem has been vanquished with current techniques and skills, and so there's no concern any longer. For the next decades, what kinds of problems, I really don't know, but I assume response rate may continue to be a problem and a greater problem. I would also expect that electronic telephone gatekeepers like caller ID and message machines and so on compound the problems. I hear tell of use of laptops and video, and presumably Bill Nichols may speak to this.
Well, I don't think interviewing as we know it is going to disappear, because there are many kinds of research where the interviewer is still essential, and not merely for getting in the door and persuading and answering respondents' questions and establishing legitimacy of the survey. But there are certain kinds of topics where you need a lot of guidance, and almost anything that has a roster in it probably needs an interviewer to help the respondent through it. So I think the interviewer there will be less work for the interviewer. There will be more cases where the interviewer brings the technology and is quiet during the interview, but the interviewer will certainly still be there into the foreseeable future. But I think we'll probably have more debates on the topic of how much and under what circumstances do you want an interviewer actually involved in the data collection rather than as a delivery mechanism. I think that those will be good debates, and it won't always come out that having the interviewer is the best answer, but there will be plenty of work for interviewers in the future.
I think we've talked about the major activities that I think are in the future, and that is two or three things. One is the conflict potential between the use of the computerized interviewing and the interaction, what it does to the interaction, and what the introduction of a third person really in that interaction does. And it may not be important, but we ought to study it. The second main thing, I think, is what is the appropriate methods of interviewing when you're talking about factual information, where there is a clear definition, here's what I mean by it, and how do we get it so that the respondent can understand this, and if the respondent can't understand it, how do we clarify it? Because at the present time, I'm sure that a lot of times, the respondent is talking about this, the interviewer is talking about this, and it sounds all right, but it's just the wrong thing. The communication does not properly shared. The concept is not properly shared. And there needs to be a lot of activity toward that. And that leads to the notion of what do we mean by probing? Under what circumstances do we probe for what? And it seems to me we've got two issues. One is, for an attitude question, you don't want anything but non-direction. That's what it was set up to do. For factual information, you need some way in which the interviewer can vary from the rigidity of the question or the rigidity of the probe and do something. Now, I don't know what he does or how he does it, but I think these are the two major issues. We keep talking about standardized interviewing. We kept talking about standardized measurement and so forth, but it's a big gap between the theory and the concept, and if we knew, of course, what to do, we'd have done it. But it needs to be studied.
I think they'll look very much the same. I think the field issues will be the same field issues, and there will still be a small shop versus large shop differences of interest. In fact, they may be greater. The big shops, it takes a lot of money to get into CAPI, to get into audio CASI, to develop the big case management systems to manage CADI, CAPI, and all these things. The smaller shops may have a somewhat different set of survey interests. But aside from that, I think things will as I see it, they'll probably go on pretty much the same for a while. Some of the things on the field side we are going to always be facing, whether it's recruitment of interviewers, training interviewers, tracing people, some of those will just be with us. On the technology side, I think we're going to face a number of increasing problems. One is we have to worry about changing technologies, and technology growth is going to continue, and we're going to be driven by changes in hardware and operating systems and changes, new versions of software, so that people who are into CAD and CAP are going to have to continually worry about adapting to the changing technological environment. And that's probably going to occupy more and more of our time in the future. And then there will be new technologies. Certainly audiocassie is with us and is probably going to grow in a variety of ways, so there will be a shift again to new technologies there. And it's hard to know. Well, we also have, the growth of internet and web surveys. We'll see how far they really go, but I suspect they will turn out to be a major new activity of survey data collection. We are going to have to cope with both inside of academic and government shops and as potential competitors in commercial shops where they may not always be done well enough to give a proper sample. We've always, in survey research, had to worry about the sort of glitzy, low-quality product produced by the commercial sector, or some parts of the commercial sector, and disrupting the respondents and maybe making it hard to show what good quality research is. But I think that may continue to be an increasing problem in the future.